human devastation, and Supreme Court history.
Please, I'm begging you, do something. I want to live. Everyone just wants to live.
Global outrage as horrific images emerge showing atrocities committed by Russia against Ukrainian civilians.
They are lying there, some of them shot in the head, some of them are shot blindfolded.
President Putin's military shifts its battle lines from cities around Kyiv to eastern Ukraine.
Remember, I got criticized for calling Putin a war criminal. You saw what happened in Bucha. He is a war criminal.
Meanwhile, President Biden doubles down on his condemnation of Russian President Putin and imposes new sanctions. Plus,
the yeas are 53, the nays are 47, and this nomination is confirmed.
History is made as Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson becomes the first Black woman confirmed to the Supreme Court. Next.
This is Washington Week. Corporate funding is provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by Ku and Patricia YUEN through the YUEN Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose HIRSCHEL and Andy SHREEVES, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Once again from Washington, moderator Yamiche Alcindor.
Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is now entering its 7th week, and this week, the world saw carnage and brutality unlike anything we'd seen before in this conflict. A warning, some may find the following images disturbing. Russia's military withdrawal from Bucha, a suburb of Kyiv, exposed atrocities against Ukrainian civilians. Some people were found dead with their hands tied behind their backs, others with gunshot wounds in their heads. Terrified residents described how they survived as their city was under siege.
We were in the basement for 35 days. There was shelling all the time. Sometimes there was no water. Sometimes there was no food.
A Russian attack also killed dozens of people at a train station in eastern Ukraine that was being used for evacuations. On Tuesday, in a fiery address to the UN Security Council, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky took the body to task and demanded more action.
Where is the security that UN Security Council must guarantee? There is no security. Where is the peace the United Nations was created to guarantee? Now we need decisions from the Security Council for peace in Ukraine.
On Wednesday, President Biden introduced a new round of sanctions targeting Russian banks and elites and Russian President Vladimir Putin's own daughters. Joining me tonight to discuss this and more, Simon Ostrovsky, special correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. He is joining us from Kyiv. Nia Malika Henderson, senior political analyst for CNN, and Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters. Thank you all for being here. Simon, I want to start with you. You reported and saw firsthand the carnage, the human devastation in Bucha. What sticks out for you in your mind as you think of all that you saw this week?
Well, I remember how the week started with a trip to Bucha on Sunday. When we toured the city and saw the dead bodies strewn through the streets, some of them, as you said, with their hands tied behind their back, and how that became the headline around the world. But I think what a lot of people don't realize with all of the coverage that's been focused on the town is that the atrocities that were perpetrated during the period that Russia was occupying the area were much more widespread than just the town of Bucha. I've been traveling to towns throughout the Kyiv region, throughout the neighboring Chernihiv region, throughout the areas that Russian troops came down from the north towards Kyiv into and held for roughly a month, depending on the areas that you go to. And we've heard stories like the ones that have been coming out from Bucha absolutely everywhere. Stories of soldiers coming to people's homes, taking them away, and those men and women disappearing, and then their bodies only being found once the Ukrainian troops came in and liberated the areas. I think the other thing that's important to understand is that this was not a recalibration by the Russian forces towards eastern Ukraine. This was a Russian defeat in the areas around Kiev. They retreated, and now they are sending their troops to eastern Ukraine because the Ukrainian forces kicked them out of this area. So the fighting has been very heavy in some of these towns. A lot of the civilians who were killed in these areas died in fighting between Ukrainian and Russian forces, in shelling and aerial bombings from Russia. And sadly, and I think shockingly, because of the orders that Russian troops had to go around and to cleanse the areas of undesirable people. And I think that's what's emerging over the last few days.
And Simon is talking about sort of all this carnage and all the things that he saw, not just in Bucha. Jeff, I want to come to you. Poland's president told CNN this week that this was a genocide carried out in Ukraine, rather, by Russia. But President Biden, while calling Putin a war criminal, has not wanted to use the word genocide. Can you talk a little bit about how the president is balancing his personal thinking around this versus U.S. policy and how he's talking about what's going on as we see these devastating images?
Sure. Well, I think we've seen with President Biden over the last several weeks during this awful war that sometimes his personal feelings get a little bit ahead of U.S. policy. But he has not gone so far as to call it a genocide. He has called it a war crime, and he doubled down on that this week, which you played in your opening clip. And he continues to call President Putin a war criminal. And there's even discussion starting about how to try that and how the United States would be involved in that without being a member of the International Criminal Court. But in terms of that line that you're referring to, Yamiche, I think that we will continue to see President Biden let his feelings come out, and the White House will say he's speaking from the heart, even if when he says something, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a shift in policy. Like there's not a U.S. policy to go for regime change. That's not U.S. policy. But President Biden did say Putin shouldn't be in power. He said he called him a war criminal before that was the policy of the United States. And now policy kind of caught up with him on that one. And you heard President Biden referring to that as well. So I think we'll continue to see that. And I think that it's absolutely burning within him to criticize what he sees President Putin and Russia doing in Ukraine, and him wanting to do as much as he can to stop it.
And Jeff, sticking with you, the White House announced new sanctions this week, including targeting, as we said, Putin's daughters. What's the aim there? And if you could, talk about how President Biden is trying to balance being tough on Russia with the limited toolkit that he has.
Sure. It's largely an economic toolkit, and that's why so much of what the United States has done, along with its Western allies, has been in the realm of sanctions. And targeting Putin's daughters is another example of getting close to the president of Russia. He's the president of the United States. President Biden and Western allies have done other sanctions on oligarchs, so rich people around President Putin. But this was going all the way into his family. And I think the strategy there is just to continue to sort of tighten the screws, as it were, around President Putin to impact the people who he cares about, to impact the people around him, and have a hope that will impact the policy that he is implementing. It hasn't so far. It's certainly not led to President Putin pulling back on his military advancements and his military goals anyway in Ukraine. But it is certainly making it much harder in Russia for Putin and for the military writ large because of the financial fallout that is happening.
Yeah, and Nia, Jeff's talking about the tightening the screws around the neck of Vladimir Putin, but the president of Ukraine says that there's not enough being done. And his speech to the UN was incredible in some ways, because he was really saying, you need to do more. How is that what are the politics of that, given that this is really tension that continues to build and build, with Ukraine wanting more and the West wanting to help and being sympathetic, but not doing nearly what Ukraine wants?
Right. In that speech, Zelensky said, you all see this. And this that he was talking about was these mass killings of civilians and their bodies laying on the street. He went into great detail about what the scenes were there of those massacres of innocent civilians. He seems to be trying to shame the West into more action, asking these international bodies that claim to stand for peace and security, asking them to actually live up to what they claim to stand for, to send many more weapons, the kind of weapons that would advance the Ukrainian cause much further, as well to cut off the spigot of funding to Russia in the form of paying for oil and gas and coal exports from that country. Billions of dollars is still flowing into the Russian economy because Europe is so inextricably tied to Russia and they need that fuel. You've seen some moves by some of these European countries to try to wean themselves of particularly coal in the near months, but it is at this point a situation where you essentially have these European countries funding the war efforts. And as much as the United States has done what the United States has done in terms of tightening the screws with these sanctions and targeting Putin's daughters and the billionaires in Russia as well, as long as this money continues to flow to Putin, you've got Zelensky knowing that that's essentially funding this horrific effort against his people. You heard Biden in his speech this week say this is a long slog. Most likely, the sanctions so far haven't worked, and you have in Putin somebody who is fixated like a madman on Ukraine and doesn't understand kind of the rules of war. And we've seen some of those horrific scenes, and Zelensky over and over again to the Grammys, to anyone who will listen, essentially saying, the West, your thoughts and prayers and your sanctions are great, but do much more in terms of helping Ukraine defeat Russia.
And Simon, Nia's talking about this long haul, this long slog that's ahead. You talked about Russia retreating. What more can you say about the strategy that Russia has for trying to keep this war going as it drags on, and as Ukrainians are saying that they're ready to fight on and defend their homeland?
Well, I think that the Ukrainian authorities have warned that there's going to be a major offensive that they expect in the east, in the Donbass region. There's been fighting for weeks now where the Russians have tried to join their southern force that has gotten all the way to the border with Crimea and to the city of Kherson that they have occupied. And that force wants to join with troops in the north that are fighting in the Luhansk and the Donetsk regions. And if they were to do that, then they would encircle quite a large force, a Ukrainian force in the Donbass that has been fighting there since 2014, since 2015, when this war actually started. I think the Russian strategy so far has, in many cases, risen to the level of a war crime with what we've seen with the bombings of cities like Mariupol, which seem indiscriminate, where civilian areas are being targeted. And in places like Yahidne, in the Chernihiv region, where Russia retreated from recently, I heard a story a couple of days ago from residents of that village where the entire population of the village was held as a human shield in the basement of a school that the Russian troops that were stationed there were using as their headquarters. So what I'm afraid of is, and what I'm worried about seeing in the future is, when we do hopefully eventually see Russian troops pull back, we're going to find out that these kinds of things that we've seen in Bucha, in the Chernihiv region, and Kyiv region now, have been happening and are happening right now in the areas that Russia continues to occupy. And I think that that's why Volodymyr Zelensky is speaking with such urgency and speaking in any forum that he can to try to get as much help that he can, because I think Ukrainians, after seeing what they saw, know that they have no time to spare in order to save their people.
And really quickly, Jeff, before we go to the domestic politics, I'm just wondering, what's the White House bracing for here when you hear all that Simon is talking about?
Oh, I think they're just bracing for it to get worse. I think they're bracing for more images. I think they're bracing for more battles. And this kind of thing, of course, is, in addition to being outrageous, also raises pressure on President Biden, on the Biden administration, on the West in general to do more. And I think those are all things that the White House is preparing for and seeing coming on the horizon.
Yeah, and certainly White House officials are also concerned about sort of how all this is going to impact domestic politics and inflation and gas prices. So there's so much more to talk about Ukraine. But thank you so much, Simon, for joining us and for sharing your reporting. Meanwhile, on Thursday, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson made history when she became the first Black woman ever confirmed to the Supreme Court. Today at the White House, Judge Jackson, alongside the president and vice president, celebrated the moment.
It has taken 232 years and 115 prior appointments for a Black woman to be selected to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. But we've made it. And in the poetic words of Dr. Maya Angelou, I am the dream and the hope of the slave.
A powerful moment. Earlier this week, I talked to a number of Judge Jackson's closest friends. Here's what two of them had to say.
It feels like, ah! And it's coming. That's my emotional response, but it does feel like it's a coming full circle. This is what we recognized in her so many years ago.
During the hearings, just watching her, I felt her pain, to see what she went through, to see that she was strong, that she persevered. It really speaks not only to Black women, but women everywhere.
Nia, what's the significance of this moment?
You know, this is a huge, huge moment. You saw that she was so moved in that ceremony today, and millions of Americans all across the country are moved too. Not just Black Americans, but white Americans too, to come to this moment. So often, if you think about the civil rights struggle and the sort of Black freedom struggle in general, it has been about prevailing on the courts to recognize the humanity of African Americans, the full humanity, the equal humanity of African Americans, and we know that that hasn't always been the case in previous centuries with judging how African Americans fit into this country. And now you fast forward to this day, and you think about people like Thurgood Marshall, you think about people like Constance Baker Motley, who was a clerk of Thurgood Marshall, as well as a hero to Ketanji Brown Jackson. She stands on their shoulders. She talked about them in her speech. And in that moment where she said, we've all made it. And Yamiche, when I got on here with you, I said that to you. And I think that, you know, might become a sort of catchphrase among African-American women who haven't seen themselves in these positions of power. Not because they're not qualified, not because they're not smart enough, because they were, quite frankly, barred from holding positions like this. You saw today in Joe Biden. I mean, he was happier than I think we've seen him in quite some time.
Well, he was actually
over these last.
He was so happy at the White House. And I think I want to also ask you one other thing, which is that she said that she was the inheritor of justice for all and the promise of America. But some of her friends also told me that in this representation, they also see that there are limits still, that this cannot be sort of where things stop, that this country has so much more to do, and that just having a Black woman on the Supreme Court or even a Black woman vice president, that's not enough. Talk a bit about that, too.
No, I think that's exactly right. And we sort of went through this discussion as well a few years ago when Obama was elevated to being the first black president. And that was obviously a watershed moment, but still so much work to be done in terms of breaking down barriers for African-American women of all socioeconomic backgrounds. You know, on the one hand, I sort of smiled when she said we've made it, but I kind of said, well, have we all really made it? Because we do know that there's still these barriers based on racism, based on sexism as well, that we saw on display, quite frankly, with the hearings and the way that she was treated and the sort of racial undertones and overtones, quite frankly, and the way she was treated with disrespect even after she was confirmed with that 53 vote margin. It was a remarkable moment to see Vice President Harris, the first African-American woman to be vice president, to read that into the record and make history. That was quite a moment. But it was also a moment where you saw some Republicans essentially just walk out and show such disrespect for that moment.
And what Nia is talking about, Jeff, is sort of the partisanship of this, the politics of this. What do you hear from the White House about this moment and what it means to them? But also, I want to, if I could scoot in a second question here, which is that Mitch McConnell has said that he's not sure that he will let another nominee through if Joe Biden gets a second chance at this.
Yeah, a couple things. One, I think in terms of how the White House is reacting, it was just a joyful day at the White House. And you saw Jen Psaki afterwards in her briefing try not to tear up because of the emotion of the moment for her and for everyone at the White House. Politically, Yamiche, it's important to mention, this is an example, and it's a pretty concrete example of President Biden making good on a campaign promise. Presidents don't always get to do that. He had this opportunity, and he fulfilled it by nominating Judge Brown Jackson, and now with her confirmation, he can say, look, I didn't just promise to do that, I fulfilled it, and that's a big deal for him. And it comes politically at a time when he is not doing super well in the polls, and only several months still until the November elections. But this could be a jolt or a positive jolt in the arm for Democrats, for progressives, for Black women and men who are an important part of the Democratic constituency that President Biden needs. To your question about Mitch McConnell, surely that also is part of the overall political picture here. If indeed Republicans end up gaining control of the Senate and perhaps the House as well after November, and should there be another Supreme Court opening, Mitch McConnell has said very clearly that he would follow the same playbook he did at the end of the Obama administration, which is not let it happen. And Democrats don't always vote about the Supreme Court. Republicans are much more effective at getting their voters out to vote in favor of a candidate because of what's at stake at the Supreme Court. I'll be curious to see if that changes at all now. Not that there's any openings expected anytime soon on the Supreme Court, but you never know. We certainly saw at the end of President Obama's presidency that an opening can come up unexpectedly.
Yeah, well, in some ways, the White House will really have to calibrate that, but they do have a lot of other challenges. Jeff, I want to, in the minute and a half that we have here left, ask you about COVID, because it is the reason, of course, why, unfortunately, we're remote tonight. It's the reason that so many people in D.C. are wondering how to move and navigate through this. There are a number of people, high-profile people like House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Attorney General that now have tested positive this week. How concerned is the White House about a spike in COVID cases, and specifically also about the president's health?
Yeah, it's also the reason I have a husky voice, so I apologize to your viewers for that. As far as the White House is concerned, what was interesting to me today is their strategy seemed to shift early this morning to preparing the country and the world and the media for the possibility that President Biden might get COVID. They've been saying, of course, that they're taking precautions, and they have. And yet he was certainly very close, perhaps not under the CDC definition of a close contact to Speaker Pelosi earlier this week, but very close. And, of course, he's been around Vice President Harris as well, who has been exposed. I think they are worried, but I think they're trying very hard not to project that. And yet also giving the sense or giving a heads up that if he does, they're ready for it, and they think and they say that he will still be able to govern.
And Nia, last 30 seconds to you. There was this $10 billion COVID relief package that was blocked by Republicans over immigration. If you could, in the last, now I'm told 15 seconds, can you explain the politics of that?
You know, listen, we'll see if it happens. I mean, you have Republicans not wanting to spend this much money. You have them tying it to immigration reform. For now, the Senate is out for a recess for 2 weeks. We'll see if when we come back, whether or not they want to take up this $10 billion, which would be for COVID planning in the future and testing and vaccines in case there is another surge going forward.
Certainly. Well, the White House is saying that they definitely need that money. Thank you so much to Nia and to Jeff for joining us and for sharing your reporting. We'll continue our conversation on the Washington Week Extra. This week's topic, COVID-19 and more revelations on the January 6th Capitol attack. Find it on our Facebook, website, and YouTube. And also tune in Saturday to PBS News Weekend. Anchor Jeff Bennett, will talk to astronaut Mark Vandehine about his record-breaking stay on the International Space Station. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yami Shalsendor. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week is provided by...
For 25 years, Consumer Cellular has been offering no-contract wireless plans designed to help people do more of what they like. Our U.S.-based customer service team can help find a plan that fits you. To learn more, visit consumercellular.tv.
Additional funding is provided by Ku and Patricia YUEN through the YUEN Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose HIRSCHEL and Andy SHREEVES, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.